Ready? Okay. So I'm Maggie. I think most of you probably know me, and this is going to be my second awakening video, which is not just the second experience I had, but I chose to share the first one first because it was much easier to describe. This one is was much more of an experience that kind of went beyond, I think, what we have the words to describe. So I'll do my best. Bear with me. And I kind of have to preface the experience with sort of where I was at when it happened. So it happened at, I think, my second or third meditation retreat. I was a fourth-year surgical resident, and I had just finished, or was about to finish, my trauma rotation, which is a very, very busy and dramatic rotation at one of the county hospitals in Atlanta. And so I had been really struggling up to the retreat with death and illness and the idea of fairness. And, you know, I did not grow up religious, but I would say that I believed in a God, but I never really understood what that word meant to me. And one of the things that I was really struggling with, especially and it sort of peaked right before this retreat during this trauma rotation, was, you know, I would see such awful things, and I would ask myself, how can there be a God? And I see all these things happen. And Doug had said to me in conversation one time, he had said that there's no difference between the sacred and the profane. And intellectually, I think I knew, I kind of understood what he was trying to say, but I did not know what that was in my heart. I didn't really understand it. And there were several instances that were really hard to take, but there was one in particular, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it was a young girl who died very dramatically on the operating room table. And when I say young, she was 10 or 11. And we did everything we could, and it was it was one of those instances where you think this is not fair. This shouldn't happen to this little girl. And it was dramatic in a sense that, you know, it was very hard for the entire healthcare team. The nurses were crying, the surgeons, the anesthesia staff, we all had a really hard time with it. And as it was happening, and when we finally, you know, realized that there was nothing we could do, I actually felt nothing. And for a second, thought that I was this monster. I was like, what is wrong with you? Look at the people around you. This is a big deal. And then I had the thought that, no, this is a big deal. You're just not able to deal with it right now, and it's going to come up later when you can deal with it. So that sort of prefaces the meditation retreat. I came into the retreat saying, this is a safe space, and you have all of these things that have happened that you haven't dealt with. You know, I think I'm not unique in that people in that line of work get very, very good at compartmentalizing. And so I set the intention that if that weekend was the time for me to deal with this stuff, then let me deal with it. Give me, you know, the strength to see it and understand it. And the first night was probably one of the most painful experiences of my life. And not just painful in that there was pain there, but I was suffering. I sat down, and it was a rerun of all of the worst traumas I had seen, not just on that rotation, but in all of my years of being in training. And I cried through all of it. And I kept asking, you know, why would this happen? Why would this happen? And then the next morning, the meditation was a little more peaceful, but there was still a lot of pain there, and there was still that question, why? And then in the back of my, you know, consciousness or whatever, I heard the response was, who is it that's asking? Who is it that needs to know? And I realized that it was my ego who was asking these questions, why, and expecting things to be fair. And so I was able to let it go. And there was still that pain, but it wasn't suffering, and that question, why went away. And I was no longer rerunning, having a rerun of all of these traumas. And the rest of that day, that was Saturday, was fairly uneventful. And then on Sunday morning, sat down, and this is where it gets really hard to describe. I thought about, for just a moment, I thought about this little girl. And it's, as I describe this, it's going to sound like I was hallucinating, but it was, I got sucked into the moment, I relived the moment with this little girl. And not just as myself, I was the room, I was the girl, I was everything. And I had this, I think the best way that I can describe it is that it was the universe's experience of this moment, not just and I was still having the human experience, but at the same time, it was so complete. And when we use the word love and God as humans, it falls so short of actually describing what that is. And I think in that moment, that was what that was. There was nothing lacking. It was so, I was so full of life, and it was in a moment of death. But again, seeing that as a moment of death is such a limited perspective. And after that, it completely changed the way that I view death and illness, and the way that I interact with my patients and other people. And I think, what we really need in this world, but in particular in my profession, are people who can be present. That what really heals people has nothing to do with being a physician. It's a quality that's innate to all human beings, and that is just being completely present with that person in that moment, and seeing it as perfect, regardless of what's happening. And that is what Doug meant, or that is how I understood it when he said there's no difference between the sacred and profane. You can have these absolutely horrific moments, and there is so much beauty and love there, and it's God. I saw God in that moment. So that's the second awakening story. I hope that I can't convey. I mean, I get goosebumps talking about it. It was something that I cannot convey in words. It was so huge, but it completely changed my whole outlook on life and death. So that's it.